In June of 1968, Oakland Superintendent of Schools, Stuart Philips, tendered his resignation. To quiet any possible criticism of the hiring process, the school board planned to assemble an outside screening panel to recruit qualified candidates. Philips would not officially leave office until June of 1969, allowing 12 months to hire a new superintendent. But the board seemed to be in no hurry and did not assemble the panel until December, 6 months later. Thus began a series of missteps that saw the search for Philips' replacement drag out for 18 months and included 4 separate attempts to hire a new superintendent. Initially, the public was generally unaware of the board's plight, but the melee that resulted from the second hiring attempt was front-page news. Arrests were made at the school board meeting that night, and during their trial they would be known as the Oakland Five. Public disapproval for both the hiring process and the board itself spiraled out of control.
They had appointed a superintendent from Las Vegas in 68, 69. They found out as superintendent bought his own book as a book for the Las Vegas schools. And the black community, which was gaining its political consciousness, was so appalled that there was a demonstration at the school board meeting and people jumped on tables and they became known as the Oakland Five.
The search for a superintendent involves things like, meetings where activists barred the door and wouldn't let anyone leave. Activist groups even formed a shadow school board that started trying to usurp the actual role of the school board. All this sort of crazy stuff. It was kind of chaos in a way.
And this is where a guy named Barney Hilburn, one of the 2 black board members, had heard about Marcus because of Marcus's success as a high school principal. And he agreed to come out to Oakland for an interview. People around the country knew that Oakland was available, and it wasn't seen as a very enticing place. And, Oakland had about 90, 100 schools, and Marcus' feeling was that, maybe it's manageable. With all of its problems and difficulties of the past, maybe at least there's something to be done here. So he reluctantly agreed to take the job.
Finally, on their 4th attempt, the board hired Marcus Foster. Interference by activist groups had taken their toll on the board, who, contract in hand, secretly met Foster at the airport. At that point, a formal signing ceremony was just too risky. During their first months in office, Foster and his deputy superintendent Robert Blackburn formulated an innovative mini-grant program that they called New Notions for Excellence.
The New Notions for Excellence program came out of the desire that Marcus and I had to move away from centrally directed initiatives for school improvement. Before him and after him, important moves to improve the schools or change the schools or do anything at all tended to be operated out of the central office. And Marcus saw the school as the key, not someplace else.
The administrator of the program was Elliot Medrich, a young doctoral candidate at UC Berkeley.
New Notions came relatively early in the Foster administration, and it was an important component part of his effort to reach out and involve every aspect of the school community and find a way to bring them back.
Being more basic than a foundation grant, Medrich created a simple one-page application.
This was not supposed to be complicated. It was supposed to be something which an ordinary teacher, an ordinary member of the community, in conjunction with the school, could sit down and write short but thoughtful presentation of what they wanted to do and how they were going to come to understand if it was doing what they had hoped it would do, and required usually rather minimal funding.
With the availability of grant money, Herb Kennedy, Nancy Blum, Bob Pritchard, Craig Zachlot, and Bob Harder began formulating a New Notions grant proposal for an alternative school on the Skyline High School campus. They called it the School Within a School.
An interesting guy, Marcus Foster, and he started a program called New Notions. And there was money set aside for people to experiment. I don't really know when Herb first floated the idea of school within a school, but it certainly was part of that.
I started meeting with Nancy, Bob Harder, and Bob Pritchard, and Herb in the lunchroom. I was teaching at that time 5 back-to-back U.S. history courses and was on the verge of quitting teaching until we discussed that we could maybe really do something. We applied for and got this innovation grant.
And I applaud Marcus Foster for that. He came in and had this sense to offer funding for innovative ideas in the district, which certainly were sorely needed. And I was the one who put together the proposal that fell to me to, type it up into a presentable thing and submit the proposal, see what happens. And it was kind of mysterious. You send it in, and there was a pause, and we were informed the grant was, okayed, and now we're going to be a thing. The funding was $4,000. And although I was very instrumental in helping to draft this proposal, and it was funded, I was actually sent away from Skyline in the fall to teach in junior high.
Because we got it approved in the spring of 71, probably around March, and then the issue was we need to get 200 kids. 200 students would justify having 5 teachers.
So what evolved was taking volunteer students, and we did insist that they be a heterogeneous group. We did not want to just become a warehouse for all the kids that had problems, but we wanted those kids too.
The type of mixture that we had both creative students and rather brilliant ones, and students who were underperforming greatly, kind of renegades and dropout type people. But I felt it was a very fertile mix.
5 staff members, Pritchard and Harder and Blum and Zach Loud and Kennedy, recruited people out of their classes, and then it kind of spread to some other classes, and that's how we got started.
And that's when we started meeting at Canyon to talk about what we really wanted this program to be.
Yeah, Lori Williams. We would meet at Lori's house during the summer, just doing the planning sessions for how the school was going to be. I can still remember some of those meetings. She was very sympathetic to what we were trying to do. She had a wonderful house in Canyon.
Yeah, she was a school librarian. She was a very liberal lady, and she was very supportive, and she wanted to be a part of it, and, was not going to give up her librarian job, but she certainly contributed to the program on a lot of different levels.
By the time we met in the planning meetings, which happened in the summer, we were talking more about curriculum and what was going to happen, what a day would look like. Herb and Craig and Bob Harder and Bob Pritchard. I was part of them as well. At the time, I wasn't a part of the program. I was very interested in it, but I was a substitute teacher in the district.
Our first major event after the planning session was what we decided before school started to invite students and faculty to go to Kirby Cove in Marin County and do like a weekend so that we could change the structure of the normal teacher-student relationship in the classroom, explore new possibilities for how we all might get along together. We had to climb down from a parking lot down to where we were camping, and Bob Harder, he slipped and he broke his leg.
And then when Bob Harder had his accident, I took his position as a substitute, but I knew the program pretty well because I'd been in on that planning stage, and I knew I loved what it represented.
The School Within a School began its first term in the fall of 1971. As a new experimental program, the staff and students explored the uncharted educational landscape together. Some things worked, some didn't. The first few months were a learning experience for everyone involved.
We all sat down and said we didn't want to do the same old thing. And each of us talked about what we had hoped would be coming out of this. I mean, a lot of it was process. But we all agreed that we would have like these core groups, and it would have certain kinds of accountability, not as rigid as the regular school, but accountability as far as attendance and things. And in the morning, to have our morning general meeting, and, everybody would hug each other, and there'd be an outlet of emotion and hopefulness and a lot of, I think, smart discussion about, how we were going to change how education was approached.
We had long meetings. The staff did. The 5 of us, we would meet after school almost every day. We shared a lot of the positive stuff we had going on. I remember we were, kind of giving feedback to each other about, what was going on that was good and what was bad, because in the first semester it was pretty loose as far as kids could wander when they want and come to class when they want.
Like there's lots of people here who at the beginning kind of fell apart for a while and they didn't have anyone to tell them what to do anymore. And when that happened, they fell apart. But, they got it back together pretty soon, and now they got their own drive and their own individual push.
Still, with a relatively small teaching staff and the myriad of course offerings, more help was needed.
But we were going out and, having the students make presentations to the university people who were working on teacher credentials. Herb took people to Stanford, I took people to San Francisco State, to Hayward, and so, I think all of that, again, an important part of the learning experience, because it helped us define what we were trying to do, and the students define what we were doing.
I went to San Francisco State and got into an educational program for alternative education. They got me hooked up with school within a school. So I did some of my student teaching there. Herb Kennedy was my mentor teacher. School within a school. It was still a new program, and they were trying to change things and see if anything worked. What worked, what didn't. We didn't have classrooms and stuff. I remember teaching in a closet just about.
One of the reasons Byington ended up in a closet, to teach, is because we didn't have enough room. Remember, we weren't doing regular classrooms. We were breaking up into small groups and doing, specialized kinds of classes.
Aside from student teachers, Herb Kennedy sought out volunteers. One of them would become a big part of the program was Bob Pickus, a former Peace Corps volunteer who met Herb at Stanford.
Bob Pickus, he was such a talented man. I think he was a student of Herb's at Stanford, and he came and volunteered to teach there. He worked tirelessly.
Bob Pickus was wonderful, gosh. He was such a saint. And he donated so much to that school and never got paid a penny. He wasn't a full-time teacher, but he was there full-time volunteer. We were so amazed at his dedication. And he was dedicated to the experiment, to what we were doing. And that's what kept him there, and he loved it. And he just became our full-time volunteer, my God, every day, and teaching classes and doing it all.
Near the end of the first semester, David Turner was hired as a full-time teacher, and Nancy Blum made a deal to rejoin the program.
Yes, she was at King Estate, and I hadn't been hired fully either, and we were all politicking to have that happen, and it finally happened in December. We both Nancy and I had seemed to arrive around the same time.
Somebody put me on to the head of the grievance committee for the teachers union, and he was just stellar in the courtroom. But we made a deal that I was willing to work full-time and get half-time salary. That's how much I wanted to be up there.
She got screwed, and we fought with Swanson about that a bunch of times. We wanted her to come, and then she finally was made full-time.
After the semester break, SWS held a week-long forum where the strengths and weaknesses of the program thus far were discussed and changes planned.
We had that breakout session, that big session in the auditorium, at the end of January. It was at the semester break, because we felt like the semester break was a good time to assess everything and figure out how we could do things better. And we did it all as a school, the whole group.
Yeah, I loved that thing in the auditorium. I thought it was brilliant. Yeah, and it seemed like just about every student talked. So we must have been doing something right that so many people participated. It went on for 4 or 5 days.
This event resulted in a long list of student interests, some of which would become mini-courses, many of which would be taught by the students themselves.
And there was a system created around what people wanted to learn and what people wanted to teach, and then matching all that up.
The New Notions grant application required the approval of the school principal, Leo Croce. But when the program began in the fall of 1971, Skyline had a new principal, and this man, David Swanson, seemed unprepared for the effect that an alternative school would have on his campus.
We often had difficult times with David Swanson, but he was a little nervous about the whole experiment. It had been laid on him, he felt. Started under Croce, the principal before him, and he was not enamored with it, and we would have these long meetings in his office about what we were doing and how we were doing it.
In the meantime, we were out of control as far as he was concerned. I mean, we were taking people off campus and, having people go to Berkeley to take classes and audit classes at Merit.
The biggest issue he had with the program was the freedom of the kids in school, within a school, to be that way in front of the other kids.
I think I do remember some statements like, well, how do you expect us to deal with the fact that you got kids running around everywhere and kids in the other programs want to be in your program? I mean, how do you expect us to deal with that, huh? That kind of tone.
We knew the criticism of this whole business of student control, and so that's what we were faced with. Because every goddamn kid who was out there getting caught wandering around, should be in class, cutting, whatever, they would all say they were school within a school. So we got dumped on. And that comes back to bite you as well. Plus, our own kids were doing enough of that.
I remember doing different classes and having groups of kids, but I also remember hearing that some kids weren't going to class. They were just hanging out or whatever.
We had a lot of, knockdown, drag-out arguments about, we should let these guys just go and do their thing.
And I remember I used to have some philosophical differences with Craig, particularly. Me and Craig used to go at it about how free it should be. Maybe I was a little more conservative that way, not believing that we should just open it up completely and give the kids complete license to do what they want to do. And
I read a lot about Summerhill and the various alternative programs that were going on in other places, and I think our goal was to make this more like a Summerhillian type program. Freedom and control were conflicting issues.
As I look back on it, I get the feeling that it was an ideal for him. Now we have an alternative school. Shouldn't it be like Summerhill? Like that's the end-all, be-all.
My position, and I think, the position of some of the other people who supported the idea that we had to allow freedom and put responsibility back on the students themselves. I mean, how else do you prepare people to be adults?
We probably needed some structure. I mean, we couldn't the real Summerhill thing is just let all the kids do whatever they want. I'm not yet knowing what I want to do, so I'll just read these comic books. It could go like that.
The really smart kids, they were ready to learn on their own, and all we did was set them free. And the bad kids, they didn't have to be threatened all the time. They didn't have to feel like total failures. We tried to help them identify and discover skills that maybe hadn't even been tapped before.
Because there were a lot of great things that I saw happening. Even some of the hardcore kids, were doing things they didn't usually do. These kids were taking classes they were motivated to take, and it wasn't like the forced choice that the regular education program was. They took it in a form that they could digest and enjoy. So, that made it totally different.
There were a lot of the kids that goodly number were not doing much at all, and the only time I really saw some of them is when we had to do evaluation, and of course the emphasis was on self-evaluation, and they all obviously sought grades that would not have been deserved, certainly not earned.
Some people were trying to sell me on giving them better grades. I wasn't real comfortable with that, but I was new. It was like trying to figure out, how do you grade?
But I remember Herb doing that, asking the kids to grade themselves. I remember I wasn't comfortable with just saying to the kids, grade yourself and tell me why. I remember that. I had a difference with Craig and with Herb, I think, on that. Bob Pritchard, I think, had a different way of looking at it, too. Yeah, and it was different. It wasn't universal through the school. We were all doing different things.
Yeah, I did a contract learning, basically, which was that people would propose at the beginning, I want to work for an A grade, or I want to work for a C grade. And that doesn't mean they couldn't change their mind after they got into it, but that's where we started. To me, if you were present and you were learning, and you were learning some things on your own, that was worth, to me, some grade.
We had some situations that, probably could have ended us in jail. And certainly taking risks that you couldn't possibly take now. Like we used to load everybody into a van and, go down to Tuscadero for a camp out.
I do remember taking people on excursions, and I had a big van. Well, it didn't really have real seats. It had a front seat, fit 8 people in the back, and that was before rules of seatbelts. You can't take a bunch of school kids in a thing today like that.
Exactly. He had no seatbelts. And I remember that van of mine. And I used to pile everyone in there. It wasn't safe, I'll tell you that. But thank God we never had an accident. I was in a performance group called Mother Goose, and we would go around to the correctional institutions for the kids. Prior to my working in School Within a School, I did this, and the kids loved it, the kids that were locked up. And so I brought that same stuff to School Within a School. It was improvisational theater techniques that I had learned from Mother Goose that we performed on Powell Street in San Francisco. It was on an upper loft. People would come. We'd do improvisational theater. And almost all of the things that I brought to the school evolved out of that Mother Goose group that I was in. And seeing kids have that experience with improvisational theater, discovering something they didn't know they had, it was a lot of fun. I loved teaching it.
I remember one of the things that Bob Pritchard did that he was very proud of was he did this oral history course. And he was bringing in people who had been in the earthquake in 1906, people who were around when Black Bart was, robbing stages. And there was no other way to have experiences like that.
Spiritual rediscovery was kind of like a mix of comparative religion and tapping into the current of the time where people really were increasingly rediscovering mystical traditions, spiritual traditions, either Asian ones or Christian ones. We did quite a few field trips, took the kids to the Zen Center in San Francisco, and we received instructions there.
Well, for me, I did a lot of Southwestern and Western history, Mexican, because at that time it was, La Raza was becoming a thing. For myself, it was a good time. Mexicans were starting to get some recognition for a change. But also the history was lacking. If you looked in the regular textbooks, we only had a little short thing, and that was it.
We could do things like teach PE courses, not just run into the gym for an hour, but make that a day-long program. We had that kind of flexibility in scheduling.
We had a PE day, and they would remember we did bike rides, and there were hikes, and there was just a whole variety of things.
The workload we all took on voluntarily, and I'd say it's probably the most intense semester I've ever had.
It wasn't like you went in, taught your classes, and left. But we loved it, and we did it.
There was no doubt about it. It was a lot of work. Because often when you teach in a class, you've got a book. The book is your focus, but when you're using other materials and you're free form like we were in School Within a School in many ways, every day is a new adventure, You're always starting anew. So that was somewhat awesome and a challenge.
For the one semester, probably the most demanding and most productive of my entire career. That's what the freedom that School Within a School allowed.
So that was my first full-time year as a teacher, and it was quite a great experience. And you have to say, I never rivaled it again.
It was such a highlight in my life, short though it was. I've always said to people, if I could still be teaching there, I would. It was so fulfilling and such a good fit for me.
This is a very emotional thing for me because it was a real educational highlight of my life.
For the second year, both the program and the staff were downsized. Still, the basic format remained the same, with courses taught by regular staff, volunteers, student teachers, and by the students themselves, but with almost constant pressure from the administration.
And so my sense, although I was sent away, was that for 1972 it was a much smaller student body. David and I were gone.
As we went through the second year, as I recall, we were under the gun all the time, and it got down to, basically, we need to get this thing under control. They didn't like it, they didn't understand it, so they were deciding how to cut back the program.
We all knew that. I think Swanson, that was his way of phasing it out. Yeah.
And, we had some meetings that were pretty intense. We got to the point where Bob Pritchard was saying, "You don't understand this, and I'm going to punch you in the face, He got really, angry about them trying to shut this program down. I just said, well, if you're going to do this, I'm leaving. I'm going to resign, and I don't want to go back into a regular classroom.
Marcus Foster opened the door for innovation that inspired and funded Herb Kennedy to create SWS. And through that same door, other innovations gave David Swanson the authority to end the program. And those two innovations collided on the campus of Skyline High School.
I think Swanson had made up his mind he was going to get rid of it in that second year. There wasn't much that Herb could do about it.
Because at that point in time, Marcus was very much concerned with making principals feel as though they had ownership of their school community.
Herb Kennedy, he was the core and heart and soul. This was also a great highlight of his life and of his teaching career. And he went back to being a great teacher, which he was a great traditional teacher as well as a great go-within-a-school teacher. The reality is that we were out there on the cutting edge all the time, and we were always at risk.
And I know when we first created the plan for the school, we said, do we want to create the school we really feel right with, or do we want to create a school that we know the administration is going to say yes to and like? And we all decided we better create the kind of school we want. And a lot came with that as far as flack, I think.
It was chaotic, but it was, again, a continuous learning experience for us all, creating as you go. Well, that's the way I felt about School Within a School. I thought that we were working together to create a new model and a new experience for all of the people who were involved. And it certainly became a learning experience for all the teachers and for, I think most of the students.
I mean, when you look back at those newsletters and all the different things that happened that came out of individual students, I would hold that up against any high school graduating class and say, yeah, did you do this?
Marcus Foster and his deputy superintendent, Robert Blackburn, arrived in Oakland at a time when there was considerable distrust between the community and the school board. The superintendent position was more political than ever before, and the rhetoric of change would only go so far, especially since real change was needed. And New Notions would broadcast that message of change during the first months of the Foster administration. New Notions and the programs it funded are today largely forgotten. However, Foster and Blackburn's legacy is not as narrow as a single program. Their real legacy was the transformational way they managed to engender support, restore faith, and energize a dispirited community.
And there's no doubt in my mind that had he lived and had a long career in Oakland, he would have sort of fundamentally changed the community, not just the schools.
Herb Kennedy's experiment in progressive education was, in some ways, like the innovations brought to the schools by Marcus Foster. Both were touchstones in the careers of those two men. Both efforts were cut short, and both are a compelling story of unfulfilled potential that raise the question, what if?